Hi, folks. I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. A couple of quick announcements. Follow Security Weekly Productions on LinkedIn for exclusive show clips, insights, and updates across the organization. Stay connected with the hosts and fellow community members and join the conversation that's shaping the future of cybersecurity. You can also visit securitypodcaster.com to find all the links to my social media, including LinkedIn, Twitter or X, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. I share mostly entertaining nerd stuff, clips from my podcasts, and general hacking tips. That's securitypodcaster.com. Mr. Lee Neely has joined us for this segment. Lee, welcome.
Well, it's good to be here. It looks like we got a crap load of stories in common today, Paul. We must be hanging out in the same place.
That's right. Mr. Josh Bressers is here with us too for the news.
Yep, still here.
Crossing the streams.
Hello.
I love it.
Yes.
I love it.
I'm excited.
Now, I've got one that Josh will probably you'll harp on this one. So I saw an SSD advisory. They published vulnerability details and such, and it's a very detailed like Linux kernel nerdiness, right? Like this. I feel like it's people that if you're a Linux kernel developer or you're not, like it's a whole world in and of itself. So I'm not going to attempt to unpack the technical details. However, I will say that in this vulnerability description, it says this vulnerability was present only in Debian 11 due to a lack of backporting of the patch to the affected kernel. The vulnerability was patched only in July 2023. And this gets me on my soapbox of going, why are you not taking the kernel patches, the security patches from the kernel, and just applying that to your kernel as if you know better than the entire Linux kernel team, who are the smartest people in the world when it comes to the Linux kernel? Now, I don't want to downplay what you may know about the Linux kernel, because if you're maintaining your own distribution in some capacity, you've got a lot of knowledge about Linux. But when it comes specifically to security patches in the Linux kernel, there is a team of people that that's what they do. And when they say, Greg says this is a vulnerability, and we created a patch for it, and then we release it, and you're maintaining your own kernel, you should go, you know what? I'm going to take that patch. Not go, well, I don't know if I want to accept that patch because of XYZ. Put it this way. Google for Android accepts all of the patches that come downstream, come from upstream or downstream to them. They're like, yeah, we're just going to apply them.
Well, which is it?
So why wouldn't
downstream
you?
or
Google
upstream?
does it. You should too. I don't know. The stream.
The stream.
It's in the stream.
It's in
all
the
right.
stream. Okay.
I mean, there's some history for that answer, though, Paul. I worked at Red Hat for a long time, and the prevailing attitude was Red Hat would take like a Linux kernel version, and they would encase it in amber, and they would polish it and make it perfect, and then they would take whatever security vulnerabilities came in later, and they would add them to their special kernel, and they would backport fixes, and they would add bug fixes and things like that. And they would do all this work to make that special kernel like as good as it could be.
I need a t-shirt. Backporting leads to vulnerabilities.
I mean, it kind of does. But here's the thing. 20 years ago, that made sense.
That sounds obscene.
Oh, I agree. 20 years ago, we had a lot less Linux kernel code.
Right.
A lot less dependencies, a lot less drivers. So you probably 20 years, you could probably figure it out.
Yeah,
and now forget it.
And this also, remember, like the Linux kernel was basically adversarial towards vulnerabilities. So they just wouldn't call bugs vulnerabilities. And so it was kind of up to the distros to decide what is or isn't a vulnerability. And it was just a weird time. And I think we have unquestionably moved beyond that. And this is, I mean, in Debian stable now, Debian stable just takes the latest, stable Linux version and they run it.
Well, so, and there you have it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so does Android. And the thing that's bananas, Android is 4 billion devices. Like, there's basically Android. Everything else running Linux is a rounding error.
Right.
Yeah. It's wild.
That's
wait, what?
Disturbing and weird.
Yeah. That's like, that number is not inaccurate.
The fact that you just made it real, that it's lost in the noise is
right?
So wrong. And yet it makes sense.
Yeah.
So, God.
Exactly.
So I have a random question that I wanted to ask. Josh was with us in the first segment and we interviewed him. I should know the answer to this. Is there a commercial version of Unix still on the market that's still out there, or is everything legacy at this point and everything's Linux?
That's a good question. I
don't know. I grew up in Unix.
Yeah,
I think you can still get. So, does Oracle maintain Solaris? I heard someone.
I bet they do. I bet they do, because you know what? I think I read somewhere that like Fujitsu or someone was still making the Spark chips that run in those servers, and they're going to until like 2050 or some absurdly far out date.
Right.
But
I mean, because you were talking about the history in the first segment, and you're working at Red Hat back in the early to mid 2000s, and I'm like, okay, and at some point, all the web servers that I encounter with my clients, everything's Linux based. I'm like, whatever happened to Unix? I mean, Unix tended to be back end, not mainframes, but big servers, legacy systems, and I'm like, is anybody still producing Unix, or is it everything Linux today?
Some bank is still running it. Like, all of our money is going through some
still running it in legacy, and
I got bad news for you. Linux is way too new for most banks.
Yeah.
Right.
I think, but I still think there's
running it and it's still commercially supported and commercially available. That's two different questions.
OS 360's got to be still around.
Well, that's mainframe. But
every fucking
Unix,
bank has a mainframe.
That's right.
Well, VMS is still going too. So, hey.
I'm talking
HPUX and IBM's AIX is still.
It's still Unix.
Can you still buy HPUX and AIX?
Yes.
Servers, right?
Yes.
It's still out there, Jeff. To answer your question.
So
and RACF for identity management, and
again, RACF is not Unix, but
it's mainframe. That's
HPUX,
not Unix. We're talking Unix.
IBM AIX. That's still a thing. Okay. Solaris long gone.
I do want to say though that I've been listening and reading about the different types of Linux kernels in the real-time kernels, and what's the other type of kernel that makes it more perform. There's like the different types of Linux kernels that are out there that are tuned for different types of workloads. And I feel like there was the latest push, I think it was 610, 610, introduced like updates for different platforms, and these are highly specialized. And I feel like if you have a big server Unix that's a highly specialized workload, there are certain things in the way the kernel operates and interacts with the hardware that made that platform awesome for processing, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of transactions per second.
Right.
I feel like today Linux is caught up, and some of the recent things that I've learned about the Linux kernel is a different type of, I want to call it paging, but it's not really paging, but it's basically like a process would go, I need direct access to this area of memory. Like every time the kernel would have to copy data or copy over the data to that area of memory. Whereas now it can just go, I grant you access to that area of memory. There's no need to copy, and that saves like not a small amount of time, but multiplied times like, the billions of transactions that you're trying to process ends up being a lot more performant. So I feel like Linux is catching up also in the security side of it as well.
My other nerdy question is, and I'm sorry to be off on a tangent, in the Unix days, there were two versions of Unix. It was either System 5, which was Solaris, or BSD. Is Linux the various platforms, the various versions of Linux that are out there, are they based on one or the other, or is it something uniquely different?
Well, that's a rabbit hole.
It's like Emacs or VI, Jeff. Pick one.
Okay, yeah, right.
Is it
okay.
System D or is it init?
Nano. Why anything other than
Linux,
Nano?
Linux is still just the kernel, right? All the other utilities are borrowed from GNU utilities, right? Open source utilities that were derivatives of or copies of,
yes,
in
RMS,
some shape,
thank
form,
you.
or fashion,
but
some type of System 5 or BSD.
Yes.
Architect. Did I get that right, John? Am I near the mark?
You're pretty close.
On that?
I mean,
yeah,
but
right.
It's weird because you've got things like Alpine that are kind of their own thing. They don't use any of the GNU stuff, and then you have all these other distros that use like the GNU stuff. But even in the like GNU universe, there's things like System D. There's the way Debian does some things is very different from the way Red Hat does some things. It's different from the way SUSE does some things, and it's basically
which is highly annoying.
Annoying, right? But I mean, this is annoying. Everyone did whatever they wanted to do, right? That's just the way it is, and it's everyone else is wrong, and the one I use is right. That's all.
I use Arch, by the way,
which is a great distro.
And by the way, is the best version of Arch. So make sure you
Obviously.
get the BTW version of Arch because that's the best one.
What happened
as
to
endorsed
Manjaro?
on Paul Security Weekly.
Oh boy. Where do we go from there? Lee, you said you had some stories
when it was just Unix, and just saying.
Yeah, except the workstation costs $45,000, Jeff. Like,
so I mean, you and I had some of the same vulnerabilities. Although I was thinking,
but we have to talk about the hacking of millions of modems.
Yeah.
Is one we had.
Yes, we both had that one.
And
I put that in our internal Slack
Larry.
because holy crap, was that a great write-up. I don't know if everyone read the write-up, but it's very lengthy. It's very detailed, and Sam Curry did an amazing job of writing it up. And basically the gist of the story is 30,000 foot view. Sam realized he had a router and it was hacked. And he took it back to Cox Communications and he's like, this thing's been hacked. And he handed it to the person behind the desk. And they go, okay, we're going to give you a new router. And he's like, but I really want to keep the old one because I want to reverse engineer it. And then gets the weird look from the person that they're really like, no. It's a 1-for-1 swap. We keep the old one. You get the new one. You don't get to keep both. And they basically told him to go pound sand, in which time he realizes he missed the opportunity to dump the NAND flash and do a complete like forensics backup and all that stuff. And so then he kind of forgets about it for a while, talks with his friend. And I totally relate to this, right? Talks to his friends. Like, you need to like get back at that. Like, you just runs the IP address that was involved in the original incident and does all this investigation, but then goes, okay, if I was going to get into routers, I would go to the management interface of that, like what Cox Communications uses to update everyone's routers. And I would exploit that system to plan a backdoor.
That's the 064 protocol that's used.
It's T. It's a T something. I recognize it from my work with routers.
Okay, they use a new one because the old one was very, very vulnerable.
They're not just TFTP
protocol.
booting it, are they?
No. It's a T. What is that protocol? Is someone listening to the podcast? TR069.
Yeah, that's the one. It's 069. Yeah, that's incredibly vulnerable.
That's the protocol. That's the protocol.
Hacker history trivia question for Josh. Not Quadling, but Josh. What does the T in TFTP actually stand for?
It's trivial, right?
Trivial.
Yes.
Trivial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Trivial.
Yeah.
That's a trivial question.
That was a trivial question.
Trivia
question.
It was.
Think about that.
So wait, hold on. Let's get back to Sam Curry. Where are in the story is he starts looking at the web interface and REST API of the Cox Communications thing, and then, oh my God, like tons of details on that. And basically it boils down to an attacker can gain access to the management infrastructure that's used by, in this case, Cox Communications, to manage millions of routers and gain complete control over those millions of routers. He disclosed the vulnerability and it was fixed. How we got there is you have to go read the article. There's no way I could do it justice. It is just an amazing write-up. One of the most amazing write-ups I've read this year.
Who still uses routers?
Everyone.
Well,
look, not all of us use tin cans and string, let me Grandpa.
Right. Most people who get internet access from an ISP have some sort of router.
Yeah.
Nerds like us will go to their ISP and go, I don't want a router. I just want you to give me an Ethernet handoff. And if you argue with them enough, they will come out to your home and they will just give you an Ethernet port, enable the Ethernet port, give you an Ethernet handoff. Mm-hmm. And then you can put whatever device you want.
And some of us just take their router off and plug in the Ethernet to our stuff anyway.
Yeah, I thought that's what we were all doing. I'm sorry.
Right. No, but like back in the day, it was a coaxial connection.
Yeah, I had adapters.
It was not
coagulated
connection. It was coagulated, not Ethernet. So
was it RG59 or RG57?
But they would give you
like no problem. So like, I've got all the shit to do that. They would give you the argument that well, if you take out our router, like that also interacts with your TV, but like no one uses cable TV anymore. We all have some kind of alternative to that. In any case, most people have a router, and a lot of people have a router that's provided by their ISP. Like they're not necessarily nerds like us. People go, I need internet, and the ISP shows up and they connect everything up and they give you a router and they go, here's your Wi-Fi password, and you connect to it. Mm-hmm. And in some cases where I've seen it differ is the ISP can manage your router or you can manage your router. And there's all different ways to kind of slice and dice that. Also, with most of them, they have what's called an ONT, and I forget what ONT stands for, but it's basically the device that takes in the fiber optic connection, in my case, and translates that or converts it into Ethernet. And they call that the ONT.
But that's not terminology.
They kind of hate it if you, and I know this from experience, if you call them up and you have like knowledge of what that device is and what it does, and you help them troubleshoot it over the phone, they're really weirded out by that. Like, how do you know where this device is and what it does and what those lights mean? And I'm like, someone cut the cable. And they're like, how do you know that? I'm like, because I Googled the lights on the device and it tells me that there's no connection. And they send someone out and they're like, oh yeah, someone cut the cable. I'm like, yes, I know. I told you that. Can you fix it, please?
Did you cut the cable, Paul?
My son cut the cable.
There you go.
But to my son's credit, he was doing some landscaping and the cable was only buried like maybe a couple of inches deep, which is not to spec. So really not his fault. He should not have been able to hit that cable. It should have been buried much, much deeper. And so they did come out and
before you dig, you're supposed to call Miss Utility and they'll come out and with the metal detector and show you where all the wires.
But if you're just putting in, do you call DigSafe if you're just putting in garden edging?
No. Oh,
no. This cable was buried. This cable was buried way too shallow.
He just drove it into place, didn't he?
That's right.
Was it coax cable or fiber optic cable?
That was the fiber optic cable.
Okay.
Yeah. But again, everyone gets internet different ways. In any case, to answer your question, Jeff, most people have routers. Most routers are still vulnerable. We wrote a book. Larry and I wrote a book about routers in 2007. And when we looked into the security, and like our book in 2007 was really about like what you can do with a Raspberry Pi today is what we were doing with WRT54G routers back in the day, because we didn't have Raspberry Pis. But then being security people were like, oh, wow, there's like really heinous vulnerabilities. And you know what? We're pretty much in the same place we are today as we were in 2007 when it comes to router vulnerabilities, as is evidenced by the 600,000 customers of Windstream that were also without service because their routers were essentially bricked.
And this was all started with a story about modem. So all the routers still have a modem connection?
Well, no, this is a generic term that we're using for the device that's in your home. It's terrible because we call it a WRT54G router. Mm-hmm. And it's not that device, like go back to 2007. It is, yes, it's a router and it's also a switch and it's also a Wi-Fi access point all in one,
right?
Using the same processor that we call a SoC or system on a chip that is providing all of that functionality for that device. We generalize that term as router, but if I were to do it in like a real network, I would have routers, I would have switches, and I would have Wi-Fi access points, and I would have firewalls, because by the way, it's also your firewall as well. So you can separate all that stuff out into separate devices, or it can kind of all be in one.
Well, so a router today is not what a router was 20, 25 years ago. It's got more functionality, and it's more of a generic.
You can still go buy a router from Cisco, and it'll do routing and implement routing protocols, and those are still, I mean, it's how the internet, it's how packets get from point A to point B today on the internet as well. Right. Those devices still exist, but we're, again, I guess with consumer routers is sometimes the phrase that we use. And in the case of Windstream, to me, is super interesting. I have a lot of thoughts on that story, because there were security researchers at Lumen. So like Windstream came out and was like, oh, we don't know what happened. 600,000 people were without service, and all their routers, again, the consumer-based device that gives them internet access that we call a router, the red light came on. And all these customers took to Reddit and started posting like, I don't have internet access and there's a red light on my router. And that's weird. And then Lumen posted the details that there was malware on these routers, and they observed everything that they could. They couldn't really find an initial attack vector. These Action Tech routers, actually Action Tech's the company that makes these routers. Action Tech, there's no like remotely exploitable vulnerability that we could see to relate these attacks back to. And they observed some of the malware. It was kind of a common malware strain, and they observed some of it and were able to give us some details about indicators of compromise. But also in the article, they're like, we don't know what functionality or code inside of that malware that was on the router caused this denial of service, or why this particular group targeted this one ISP, because all the routers that lost service trace back to this ISP's ASN. And they're like, they don't know why some group with this malware would go to this one ISP that serviced people here in the US, a certain number of states, would just go, yeah, everyone's router is bricked. Now, I can say that.
Was there a CVE?
Having worked in these. No, we don't know if there's a vulnerability involved at all. I mean, conceivably, you could gain access to these routers with a username and password. You could put some kind of payload on these routers, maybe through some vulnerability in the web interface, who knows, that we don't know about. And that code could execute. And what I believe, some of my speculation, having worked on these platforms quite a bit, is that if you wipe the contents of the flash chip, which is the storage inside of the router, and you just wipe that contents, maybe you left the bootloader there, but once the bootloader, so if the router reboots and the bootloader starts up, the very final thing the bootloader is going to do is, where's my kernel? I need to load a kernel. And if the kernel's not there, there's usually code in the bootloader based on the error condition that goes, hey, if I can't boot for whatever reason, make the light go red, because there's actually code that you can program. We had a put this in perspective. Larry and I wrote a script for the WT54G that we called Christmas lights, and it would flash all the lights from red to green in like a row. And we called it the Christmas light script. So the lights are programmable to give the user feedback, because there's no monitor, mouse, and keyboard. So the bootloader goes, make it solid red if I can't load the kernel. And so that's my speculation. If someone has one of these routers, if you could do me a favor and just wipe the spy flash in every sector after the bootloader and then reboot it and tell me what lights go on, that'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, and when I was looking into this last week, I mean, I found it was, what I kept seeing is the firmware got corrupted, which could be deleted, as good as corrupted.
Right. Missing your kernel is definitely one. If I were to want to brick, 600,000 routers, going on the spy flash and just removing the partition that contains the kernel, or the file system partition that contains the kernel, great way to brick a router. It's beautiful.
Right. And unlike, say, the Mirai Bricker bot, the version of Mirai that would brick stuff, this one you have to replace it because it just blows the firmware away. Whereas BrickerBot you could recover.
The firmware is usually one file that does contain the bootloader, the file systems, the kernel, and like userland and NVRAM storage, right? Those are all sectors, regions on the SPI flash chip or NAND flash chip, right? So messing with any one of those can cause different kind of results. When we were working with the WRT54G, there were some bootloaders that, while it was booting up, would listen on. It's funny you had the TFTP joke earlier or trivia question. It would listen on TFTP on a specific IP address, and if it got a file, it would load that and overwrite the rest of the flash chip with the firmware that it got from that. And that was a failsafe that Larry and I used a lot, actually, in the writing of the book. However, if you overwrite the bootloader, then there is no code to provide any way to back it up. In which case, now we're talking about levels of bricking, right? I think in this case, Windstream's like, we're just going to send people new routers, because the other way to recover that is to go on the JTAG header, and then through JTAG, or sometimes in UART, you have a mechanism to rewrite the SPI flash chip in its entirety.
Right.
If that fails, if you're really good at desoldering and soldering, you can desolder the flash chip from the board, put it on a flash reader, rewrite the entire contents of the SPI flash chip. The tricky part is getting that flash chip back on the board. Now you're talking about the solder paste and special ovens and things that people are probably, that hardware hacking, are yelling at me because I'm getting some of the terminology wrong, but there are very specific ways to do that. I've seen people do that with the Nintendo Switch. No, not a Switch. What is the Nintendo gaming console thing?
The Switch is the latest one.
Yeah, I thought it was a Switch.
The Switch. Yeah, I've seen them do it with Switches to like upgrade the storage on them, or if the storage gets corrupt or whatever. I've watched these videos of people actually going through this process, which is amazing to watch. So you could, but like Windstream doesn't want to take 600,000 routers and then go, we're gonna like desolder all the chips off. Like that's way more costly than just send everyone a new router.
Right.
So I don't think these are truly. To me, these are not bricked. These are totally recoverable, and I totally want one that's been. If you want to send it to me, I'll send you my address. You can send me one, because I totally want to pull the flash chip off of it and try and recover what malware was on there. The problem is, when I read the description from Lumen, it would write the malicious code to the flash chip. It would get it into memory, and then it would delete it from the disk. So you're going to have to do some forensics and deleted file recovery to recover that, which I think is, all of this is super interesting, obviously, because I've spent the past 10 minutes talking about it. But anyway.
We're aware.
I thought a lot about
We're
this
aware.
one.
Okay.
We noticed. I would just like the idea of,
we call
these guys came up with that they came up with this attack that, the average Joe, I mean, even though it's recoverable to a Paul or some of the rest of us, the average person, they're stuck with hardware replacement. I mean, I don't want to call it terror, but I'm thinking, wait, talk about way to impact a whole shit ton of people.
Yeah, like, holy crap, could this been of a test? Of like, hey, what would happen if we did this? What would the response be? How long would it take them to realize that this has happened? Would they attribute it to us? How much could they attribute to us? Was it a test?
All right, let me ask you a question, Paul, because I don't understand this completely. I remember reading this. What are the odds, like, they let the intern push the update to the new version?
No, Lumen came out and said it was absolutely malicious software. Yeah. I mean, it very well could happen that a corrupt firmware update could be pushed. Absolutely. If you were to bork a firmware update, that's a technical term. It's very likely that these, IoT or embedded systems, we used to call them IoT devices, reboot and red light, right? Like, oops, I pushed the wrong firmware image or a corrupt firmware image. If the bootloader isn't able to validate like the hash or the checksum of that firmware, the bootloader is going to stop and go, yeah, that firmware is no good.
Sorry, Dad, we're
I'm
done.
done.
You have been bricked. Thank you for playing. Please try again later when you purchase a new device.
That's what the red light means.
Had
exactly that.
Had this been a severe attack, you would have seen your router melt before your eyes, but this is only a test.
No. That's actually not true. It would have been, your router would have grown arms and attacked you. However, since it did not, you can assume you merely bricked it and it wasn't attacked by the Chinese.
Josh.
That's the other payload. That's a different payload.
All right,
Stay tuned for
I have a
part
really
2.
stupid question. You keep talking about bricking.
We're used to that.
But isn't bricking something that's associated with with smartphones?
No, Jeff, for you, that would have been the Salem witch trials.
We didn't used to call, locking up a server or a device bricking. That's a phone term, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it's a device term. That's an interesting point.
Yeah, it's a device term.
It's not a computer term. It's an embedded device term, meaning that it is, because with a computer, I can always clear the BIOS. I can clear there's sometimes you can't. Yes, I know. Shut up. God damn it, Eclipsium man. Shut up.
I've bricked a computer before.
I have too,
you can totally brick a computer. You can turn a computer into a very large, we should call that cinder blocking.
But we didn't call it bricking.
It's more like a cinder block
back in
than
the
a brick.
day. That
so I will say that I apologize to my dad. I did in fact brick that Apple II Plus with a paperclip by accident, even though I told him I didn't. But I think it was a 2E or a 2 Plus. I don't remember. It was like 40 years ago. But anyway,
I did that. I pulled one of the Spy Flash, DIP 8 chips, and I broke the leg off of it by accident. And so
that wasn't Spy Flash, Paul.
No, it was.
Really?
It was, yes. It was a Spy Flash, yes. And it was one of the pins broke off.
My question is, before we called it bricking, what did we call it? I don't remember. But I mean,
rocking?
I always
tableting, stone tablets?
I always called it bricking.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure bricking is a term that came about in reference to
I used to just say I broke the computer.
Yeah.
Broke it.
I broke it.
So, but wait, you folks will appreciate this. So, and especially Bressers, because I talked about my job when I worked for the point of sale company in college and was learning computer programming.
Yep.
When we had this thing that we did that was very foreign to me at the time, and it was the brick. And if you did something incredibly stupid,
this explains a lot about Paul.
Job related, incredibly stupid, you got the brick. Now, there was rules. Like there had to be some kind of a consensus that it was brick worthy. It was a brick worthy offense. Like you were in a customer environment and you accidentally wiped all their data out. As an example, we would get together and we'd be like, all right, that's a brickable offense. But you couldn't just pass the brick around. We had to wait till there was a company meeting. It was a small company, so it was regular company meeting gatherings, and we would have a brick presentation, and whoever had the brick at that one time, I'm not sure how it started, anyway, but someone who had done something stupid before would then stand up at the meeting and explain why the next person should get the brick. Nice. And it was a brick presentation ceremony, often accompanied by some kind of decoration on the brick that was indicative of the stupid thing that you did. And I'm not saying you should adopt this in your company because it's absolutely terrible. It was wildly entertaining and fun, and I think enforced you shouldn't do stupid shit, but in a very public disgrace kind of way. But sounds talking about bricking, but we would call that bricking. We would use it as a verb. Like I got bricked. Like I wiped all the customer data and I got bricked.
Whoops.
And you had to display, that was the other thing, you had to prominently display the brick on your workspace in your cubicle for everyone to see, so that anytime someone walked in your cubicle, they would always be reminded, and you would always be reminded that you did something stupid.
Sounds like a healthy and inclusive work environment, Paul.
It was absolutely terrible. Now that I think about it, it was awful. Oh, but really funny.
The bricking.
But one of the my coworkers got the brick because he hit a UPS driver. Our office was near the main UPS hub. I don't know if he hit a UPS truck or the actual person. Like the person was okay, but he had to come in. So I hit a UPS driver, and
They actually gave him the brick, and they taped a little UPS truck to the top of it. It was terrible. I shouldn't be laughing. I feel like I shouldn't be laughing, but
he hit the guy so hard he flew 30 feet in the air. It was amazing.
And he got the brick for it. Oh God. Thanks for the memories,
ladies and gentlemen. We are horrible.
That was one part
beings.
I forgot to tell that story. I forgot to tell that story on Hacker History, Josh. So I wanted to make sure I got
right.
We
got it here now.
I was thinking about it. I'm like, I left something out. Like it was bugging. I left.
That's
that was the one thing I left.
Come back
out.
And tell more stories someday. It'll be fun.
So,
oh God,
do we want to talk about analgents?
Or please, let's talk about anything else, but what we've been talking.
I deliberately went
anal what?
Analgence. ANALYGENCE.
It's an unfortunately named
anal
company.
something.
Analgents.
Analgents. They're the ones that was Grinder. They're the ones that got the contract from NIST.
Can I buy this from AliExpress?
I suspect Josh knows what I mean now because he recognized the name.
Yes, I know exactly what you mean, and that was my first question: is what's a Wygenst? Because when you put anal as the beginning of your company name, I feel like something has gone terribly wrong.
And we spend enough time in the gutter already on this show.
Right. That's right.
So, I mean, I just thought it seemed like it was just yesterday. It was a little more, but that they said we're going to put out to bid to help with the NVD stuff that's backlogged and frickin' it seemed like just a couple days later they got these guys.
Who else do you hire to help you with your backlog other than anal gents or whatever it is?
I mean,
oh my goodness!
Is it just saying
backlog,
we're
front
fucked?
log, however you.
I'm sorry.
Oh God!
It's all downhill from here.
What happened, Josh? You came on the show, Josh, and it just went downhill.
I know, right?
You're the one that's supposed to be saving it.
I drug it down. Like this is what I do.
I'm worried
Josh is sabotage. You were here just to say. Josh is like, I'll stay on for the news, and I'm totally going to sabotage Security Weekly.
That's right. I'm like, dude, it's like all those routers that quit working. That's what I'm doing here.
How hard is it? Like, well, we fell over and we can't get to working anymore. Hire a company called Anal because we're fucked.
I mean, okay, look. So
has Josh bricked the show?
Yes,
I love it. Like,
all right, let's push the pushing the reset button, and it's rebooted. And okay, Josh. Okay, so in all seriousness, this is the company that NVD.
Yes, please explain the Analgents company.
NIST is hired to help enrich the data.
Well, more than that, though. So the company has a press release that they put out, and it's $125 million over 5 years. And it's not just NVD. NVD is part of the contract, but then it sounds like they're also going to do things like common criteria and FIPS compliance and some other standards work.
Ooh.
Right. So it's not just NVD. And so, like, fun fact, there's the guy who runs risk-based security, Jericho. He's been around forever in like the vulnerability space. And he told me a couple of weeks ago that he FOIA'd NIST for the NVD budget, and it was about $6 billion a year. Is my understanding is what NVD was spending on their contractor. So
I love Jericho.
Oh man,
he does stuff.
He
does stuff like that.
He's like a treasure.
I wouldn't even thought about Jericho would think to do that.
Yeah, like the guy, it's amazing. But so you figure like 125 million over 5 years when there's around 6-ish million for NVD in that. Like, yeah, that's not that much. And things like FIPS and common criteria and all the standards.
Wait, $6 billion?
6 million. Per year.
6 million per year.
Yeah.
It's funny.
And what was this contract?
Jericho, because in the first interview, I was thinking, Jericho, he just records the vulnerabilities. He never rates them or scores them or provides a criticality to them. Maybe there's something to learn from Jericho.
Yeah. There's much to learn from Jericho. There's probably much to unlearn from Jericho as well. But
that too.
That
is also true.
But yeah. So like 125 million over 5 years, like it sounds like a lot, but it's probably not that much. No. And once all things are put together.
And I figure they're going to be able to ramp up or down and get staff in way faster than NIST because they're not dealing with the federal hiring practices and all that crap.
That's right. Yeah, right. And look, and NIST was using a contractor before this for NVD.
Yeah.
So this isn't like they fired all their people and then they're hiring a contractor. It's just they're replacing contractors. It's just for whatever reason, there's been this unfortunate gap between old contractor and new contractor.
So And in fact, that then begs the question, will it be the standard government contractor process where they rehire the old team that got let go?
Probably.
It's a thing. It's
yeah.
a thing.
Oh, yeah.
And anyway, I wish them well. Actually, I'm hoping, because this business, the unanalyzed vulnerabilities, sucks. It's really hard not having enough data in there to try and make a decision.
Yep.
And they're like already chewing on, what is it, version 5 and 5.1 stuff already. They keep moving the versions and stuff forward.
Yeah.
How the hell? Yeah, this is going to help.
Oh, I want to talk about a hardware. We were talking a little bit about hardware stuff before, and this is probably one of the best hardware hacking articles that I've read, because, well, when it comes right down to it, their hardware hacking tool or technique of choice involves sulfuric acid. Now, before I go any further, I just want to caution our listeners, like, please don't try this at home. Please don't be like, I heard this on Security Weekly and I decided to start taking sulfuric acid and putting it on chips and then permanently damaging yourself or your property or both or whatever, because it's really, really dangerous. You should not do this on your own. So with that warning, ZDI published a post that talked about decapping chips for electromagnetic fault injection. And I think this is super cool. They gave a really great, actually, you can read the explanation of what fault injection is. There's a Hacker Hero segment coming up with Joe Grand, and he talks about fault injection as well. But it's basically injecting some kind of interference in electromagnetic or RF frequencies of some kind into the process in order to trigger a failure state that results in like an attacker positive result, right? Like, oh, it was checking this thing.
Like fail open?
Yeah, like fail open. Like it was checking this thing, but I injected the right amount of interference at that time, and therefore the check didn't happen, and it, like Jeff said, right, failed open. Right. But the problem is with some of the chips, to do this interference, they're underneath the cap of the chip. And so you have to find some way to remove the cap from the chip. And they talk about various methods for doing that, which are all interesting and could deserve their own blog post. So mechanical sanding or milling, chemical, thermal, or optical, using a laser to burn encapsulation. Like, this sounds like a lot of fun. Again, please don't try any of this at home. Like, this is not something I'm suggesting that you do. But they chose the chemical route and using sulfuric acid, which they say is extremely corrosive. Avoid spilling and wear proper PPE at all times. Then they have another warning that says sulfuric acid vapors are extremely corrosive. Avoid inhaling it and work in a well-ventilated area or fume hood or outside. And they have other notes. Study relevant safety information, including but not limited to materials handling, spill, contaminant, and cleanup procedures before working with any hazardous chemicals. And they say this blog post is written purely for educational purposes. Any attempts to replicate the work, you're at your own risk. Knowing all that, it's an awesome post. Awesome pictures where they basically use sulfuric acid to decap a chip to get better results when doing fault injection via electromagnetic interference. Bravo.
Yeah. What is
one of the coolest hardware hacking posts I've read this year?
What is decapping a chip?
So like if you were to just pull like a let's say a flash chip like I was talking about earlier, and it has that gray surface
epoxy
on the top,
typically epoxy.
Yeah, like the gray surface that they screen print the like serial number, model number of the chip on.
Right.
That's basically the cap. Underneath that, if you were to, like the article says, melt that away or sand that away or whatever, you would get to the actual chips that are underneath it on the silicon.
So Travis Goodspeed used to use sulfuric acid and melt them away very, very slowly. That's
slowly. You have to like little drops at a time, and then wait, and then at a little. Yes,
right. That's how we actually broke the RSA keys by doing
crazy
it.
Too, right?
It's insane.
It's an awesome technique. No, I want to talk a little bit about supply chain vulnerabilities.
I thought this one was interesting. It's because Dell PowerStore family security update for multiple vulnerabilities, and we probably would see a million headlines like this. However, when I dug into this one, it's basically a whole bunch of Linux utility library CVEs that were being fixed on a Dell PowerStore family storage server version. And some of these dated back to 2018. And when you dig into it, I was like, wait, didn't Dell buy EMC? So they bought
they did.
like a really big company that did storage stuff. But now they have Dell PowerStore. And so I was like asking ChatGPT, I'm like, explain to me the difference between, like, what is Dell PowerStore, and like, why would I use that as opposed to EMC? And at first I typed BMC instead of EMC, and it started to explain the difference between a storage device and a baseboard management controller. And I was like, wait, no. Replace BMC with EMC in that previous thing. And then it's like, oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about. Which is, I had a ChatGPT and I had a chuckle together as part of the story. But so Dell PowerStore came out in 2020, but they still had vulnerabilities in Linux utilities from 2018. So like basically Dell looked at the PowerStore platform and went, oh, we're using old versions of Linux software. We should update those, and fixed a whole bunch of supply chain vulnerabilities in this platform. But also still weird because it wasn't apparent to me like why you would use PowerStore versus an EMC product. Like I need a product marketing manager to explain it to me. But anyway, that's kind of an ancillary discussion. PowerStore is what they're calling their modern storage solution developed by Dell in May 2020 to meet the evolving demands of enterprise storage, providing flexible and scalable architecture that can handle diverse workloads, apparently. And it was using old versions of Linux that they fixed.
And on the faceplate, it says Dell EMC.
Right. I don't know. Maybe it just says Dell, Lee.
Not even EMC. I found some images from some of the products they listed that have the Dell EMC label on it.
Are you familiar with PowerStore? Is anyone familiar with PowerStore? Has anyone used PowerStore?
Nope. I remember using EMC way back in the day.
I've used Dell PowerStore before. Why?
Oh, just curious.
They suck.
Oh, okay.
Stop sugarcoating it, Josh.
All of Dell storage that I've ever used has always sucked.
So look, I would give them credit though for adding in all of these old vulnerabilities, because the vast majority of companies would just be like, oh yes, we have a new version. It fixes these 4 vulnerabilities and not at all of this like 20-year-old stuff.
Or there'd be like a note like updated Linux.
Yeah.
And that was it. Yeah. So I'm not knocking Dell on this. I think this is a good thing, right?
No.
Although really I've not used the PowerStore platform, so Quadling has his own opinions on that.
This CVE list is bananas. Like
it's massive. Like a lot of CVEs.
Yeah.
There's a lot of CVEs.
Well, I mean, I think there's a difference here between whether the functionality of the product is good or it sucks, and whether you want it to be vulnerable in the customer environment. I mean, even if it's horrible, I don't want it to be full of vulnerabilities. I mean, I'd like them to make it work right, but hey, let's clean it up and take care of it. And maybe we make a pitch for some functionality improvements.
Lee, you missed a lot by not sitting in on the first segment.
Yeah, we talked a lot about vulnerabilities and CVE, a lot.
I bet I did. I know. I figured I was kicking myself that I couldn't be there. It was just like
we were like out of breath because we were talking so much about
you guys were having way more fun than I was having. Just
remind me the next time I see you, Lee, I will kick you. Just
thank you.
I'm looking forward to it. Another interesting kind of supply chain thing, right? When I look at supply chain vulnerabilities, I'm very in tune with like a flaw in glibc. That is like one of the there's the kernel, but then there's also like most software on Linux would make a call to a library like glibc to do something usually that you don't want to write yourself, right? Is why you would rely on standard libraries. Like I don't want to write every line of code myself. I want to rely on a library, but that library like glibc has vulnerabilities. This one can be leveraged from PHP. And the leap to get to
there's a vulnerability in glibc that can be leveraged by PHP, is explained in like a 24-page blog post that goes into serious details.
Mm-hmm.
The best summary I could find of that is, they say, consequently, any attacker with a file read vulnerability and a controlled prefix on a PHP application can achieve remote code execution. Similarly, forcing PHP to call iConvert function with controlled parameters grants the attacker the same capability. And again, the link to get there to leverage this vulnerability is a lot of technical details, but an interesting supply chain kind of vulnerability that you need to pay attention to, right?
So two questions. Are most bad guys going to go to those lengths? And question for Josh, how does that get factored into any kind of scoring from a vulnerability ranking perspective?
This is one of the coolest vulnerabilities I've seen in a long time. I remember reading about this. And so this one is especially unique because when we think about the way we score vulnerability severities, this would not score particularly high by itself, but it just
what was it, like a 6.8 or 8 something?
I don't know what
it wasn't like a 10.
Yeah, no, it's not at all. But the thing is, though, PHP does some very specific
it's a
things.
medium.
Right. And it would classify as a medium by itself. But the thing is, I mean, this is like classic vulnerability. One of the classic problems with vulnerability ratings, right, is where if you look at this by itself, it is not serious in any way. But PHP happens to do some weird, like UTF-8 style encoding magic that happens to trigger this in a way that a remote attacker could leverage it. And
you guys are gonna laugh hysterically when you look up the vulnerability in glibc, CVE 2024-2961. This vulnerability is currently awaiting analysis and has not received a CVSS score.
That's because NVD.
But we talked about that. We talked about why. Yeah.
But it's like it's such a crazy and weird problem. But now at the same time, I think this is the challenge to scoring security vulnerabilities, right? Using something like CVSS is something can score really low. And if you happen to be using it in just the right way, it's actually critical. Or something could be scored a critical, but if you're not using it in that certain way, it's a 0.
Didn't Qualys disclosed other vulnerabilities? Was it with glibc that it depended on how you were calling it? And the math that you did, we covered it on the show, right? The math that you did, if you did the math in a certain way or the logic and the math in a certain way, you were vulnerable.
Yeah.
But like glibc itself wasn't vulnerable. I think it was glibc wasn't vulnerable, but it had this way it constructed the function that if you called it a certain way and did a certain operation on it, you that program was vulnerable.
Yeah,
but the library itself necessarily wasn't exploitable. It relied on a program to call it and do an operation on a specific way.
Yeah, I mean,
which again, how do you score that?
Right, exactly. I mean, this is extremely common in like dealing with, Unicode characters, just because you're dealing with multi-byte characters that might be 2 bytes in this character set. It might turn into 3 bytes if we convert it to this other character set. And it's just, I mean, I remember writing C code to do this back in the day, and it was just like buffer overflows everywhere. And I remember we'd just be like, whatever, I'm just going to multiply my buffer by 2 and I'll probably be fine. Like nobody knew. It was nuts.
I love that. If I make the buffer big enough, I'm probably fine.
Yeah, it's probably fine. It's fine. Probably fine. It's fine. Yeah.
Like we call that guessing.
I won't argue with that. Yes.
Oh, but that, speaking of data analysis, my story number 13 is the ANSI escape injection vulnerability in WinRAR. Now, here's another friggin' weird one in the context of like, how do you score it? So if you ANSI escape sequences are so you can put like backslash and like you and then like a number and then your text. When it shows up in the terminal, it'll be green, right? So we call that ANSI escape sequences. So if you put if WinRAR honors ANSI escape sequences,
you can put that in the comments of your RAR file. And if you put then special malicious anti-escape sequences in your RAR file comments, when you list the contents of a RAR file, those get interpreted by your shell and could cause denial of service conditions. And there's an example that
Files
pulls from
format fuckery.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. But there's so the talk from so this vulnerability leverages payloads that were talked about in a 2023 Black Hat presentation titled Weaponizing Plain Text Anti-Escape Sequences as a Forensic Nightmare. I'm sure we're all familiar with that talk and have memorized all the details of it. But essentially the payload they pulled from that was via certain escape sequences. If you do that in a RAR file, they inserted the payload, and then once you list the contents of the RAR file, all of your mouse coordinates get printed out in your shell. So as you move your mouse, after you print the list the contents of a RAR file, as you move your mouse, all of the coordinates in like some, hexadecimal or whatever representation are printed out over and over and over again on your screen. And I just thought that was a really wild vulnerability, and you should definitely go read it because it's an awesome read.
Have you ever checked POC GTFO?
No.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I do not.
Really? Okay. POC : I think GTFO, proof of concept or get the fuck out. It's Travis Goodspeed's equivalent to a Bible, in which he puts some of the coolest hacks he's ever seen in one spot.
Oh, it's a book.
It's actually 2 or 3 of them at this point.
Okay.
And one of the first ones, remember, he started handing these out as like magazines, like zines back in the day. Mm-hmm. But you could get the electronic format of it, the PDF, which if you opened the PDF, if I remember this correctly, if you opened the PDF with WinRAR, it would spit out the PDF in full. But if you opened it in, good Lord, like Word or something, it opened up a picture. Like it was unbelievable amounts of file format fuckery.
Nice.
It's very much in the vein of the
exactly.
Yeah.
So Paul,
and there are CVEs attached to the vulnerability in question, which makes me think it was fixed.
Can we?
I hope.
Can we shift gears a little bit, Paul,
mm-hmm.
and start looking at some of the stories that I posted? I didn't intend to put.
Let's
many stories
sorry, Jeff.
that I put. But
Jeff, let's talk about breaches. I think it's a good.
Let's talk about breaches, and we can
change gears.
We can sort of weave in vulnerability and vulnerability scoring and so on and so forth. But we didn't have a show last week, and I think it was just before last week when the first notification came out that Ticketmaster, Live Nation is the parent company. Ticketmaster's a subsidiary.
No, I just bought. I just bought tickets. Bought tickets on Ticketmaster.
Suffered a breach. And
gotta change my password now.
I started just my way of adding stories is security breach, and it was Live Nation that came up, and there's been a few more things.
Nikki Glasser, that's who I bought tickets to, by the way, in case I know you all are wondering.
Oh, we all know that because it's all available for sale on the.
I'm not telling anything new. It's probably in the breach, right?
It's all out there, and it's PCI related because Live Nation, you buy tickets with a credit card, right? You bought your tickets probably with a credit card.
I did. Hopefully not a credit card that I stored on file.
So
they'll find out pretty soon if it was.
I'll find out pretty soon if I have to change my credit card number, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, for the listening audience, if you go to the show notes, there's sort of a progression to the stories that I posted. It started more or less with Live Nation and Ticketmaster.
Yeah. So, but Jeff, what does it mean by some credit card details? Did they qualify that in any way?
Well, one of the stories I posted, I forget which one off the top of my head, but they were talking about, basically, and this is an interesting discussion thread because it ties in a lot of things that we talk about all the time on the show. Ticketmaster is largely operating in the cloud. So we can talk about cloud security. We can talk about third party, because third Live Nation / Ticketmasters relying on I don't know if offhand if they're, let's assume that they're AWS, but they're some cloud provider. And I'm sorry, it's Snowflake.
It's Snowflake, the data lake folks that they're pointing the finger at.
So there's a lot of finger pointing going on. There's a lot of questions about, how did the breach happen? How did the bad guys get to the data? There's relationships with third-party relationships, cloud hosting, a database that's on the cloud. You can read through all the stories and get the thread, but Ticketmaster's a merchant. They sell tickets to shows and you pay with a credit card, so it's a PCI thing. Coincidentally, about a week ago, we didn't do a show last week, but there was a DOJ, the Department of Justice, filed a lawsuit against Live Nation and accusing them of having a monopoly, and about time, and there's all sorts of reasons why they do that, and they got breached at the same time, and pretty much their whole database, from what it looks like, or a good chunk of their database, which may or may not have been hosted at a third-party cloud provider named Snowflake. It almost sounds like a perfect storm where we can use this as a case study of talking about all the different topics that we talk about periodically over the months on our show. Nobody has talked about how the breach happened, but nobody has talked about any vulnerability that might have had a CVSS score and been at a CVE. More than likely it has to do with password stealing. I think I've saw references to that in one or more of the articles I posted.
It's interesting, Jeff, when we talk about the Sam Carty article and the vulnerabilities that obviously there was vulnerabilities that Sam found in there. I don't believe they got CVEs for that. Like, if you find weird esoteric vulnerabilities, plural, that could lead to some compromise, they don't necessarily get a CVE because it's in like a custom platform that you consume the platform. You don't necessarily run the software like from Snowflake, right? Like, you use their platform. So, the vulnerability aspect of that is kind of interesting.
Well, and that's actually a question I wanted to ask Josh, because he's very much familiar with the whole vulnerability disclosure notification, which in the article, which is a blog article in our show notes, which was apparently a couple months ago, but there was a statement in there that talked about the NVD came about, and it's all about software vulnerabilities. And I'm like, well, there's a whole lot more vulnerabilities that are involved than strictly software vulnerabilities. And even in our discussions in the first segment and now, we're talking about operating system kernels. You could argue that that's software, but
no, it's definitely software.
It's
but like a
kernels get IDs. So services are unique.
Services, it's a good way to put it.
So I think in around 2022, 2020-ish, give or take. Before that, CVE specifically counted services as out of scope. And now they have a rule that basically says if you want to put them in scope, you may assign a CVE ID to them. But it's definitely very squishy in the definition of whether a service should or should not get a CVE ID.
Because how do you version number a service?
Right, exactly. And this is, it also gets wild because like CISA released a document, I think a week or two ago, talking about like SBOMs for services, right? Where you're talking about, What does it mean?
I like how that Josh says CISA and the other Josh says CISA, which is incorrect. It's CISA.
The people I know who work there call it CISA.
CISA.
So
I've been corrected by people that work there, and they tell me it's CISA.
I trust them. But yeah, it's like services are definitely one of those things that it's like we don't exactly know what we're doing here. And obviously there's arguments every which way you can imagine of whether they should or shouldn't get vulnerability IDs. Because like at the same time, if you're using a service, it's not like you can use an old version of it. You're going to use a version of it you get.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah.
So
like I'm using Snowflake.
Right.
Am I using Snowflake version 1? Like I don't have a choice. Like I use Snowflake.
Exactly. Right.
That's my platform.
Upgrade your API. Oh wait, never mind. Like
let's not talk about that.
But this is where it becomes very it's very complicated. It's very complex because there's lots of different things that we've talked about in isolation. But this is sort of the perfect storm. We've got an organization, an entity, Live Nation, specifically Ticketmaster, and maybe a few more permutations that suffered a breach. Some hacking organization, and read the reports. They talk about who they are. I don't care. They were able to get to the database. Now, from a PCI perspective, they talked about they've recovered the names of individuals. They talked about hashed versions of the PAN. I don't know if it's hashed or encrypted, but they didn't get the full PAN. But a typical database for a merchant these days, since I do PCI, most merchants have figured out they don't need to keep the full PAN anymore for any reason, but they will keep the last 4 digits, so they have a lookup.
Is that what they meant by some credit card data?
Yes.
Is it the last 4?
The some credit card data is the last 4. Why
would they need to store PCI question? Why would I store just the last 4 if I can't?
If you're I mean, I'm sure all of us do this. You have some sort of account with Amazon or Ticketmaster or whatever, where you save your credit card. You'll look up and say, do you want to use the card that ends in the last 4 digits? Yeah, that's the one I want to use. So that's just a way of identifying a specific card that's sort of generic, and it meets.
Is the rest of the card stored encrypted or?
Well, most merchants don't need to store the card at all. What's very common these days is you replace what used to be the stored PAN, the card number, the credit card number, with a token, or maybe you encrypt it or you do something to obfuscate it.
I got you. So last 4 is just the identifier for the cryptographic representation of my card, which is a token that they just they send the token to MasterCard, and MasterCard goes, yeah, that's the card we have.
I mean, whether it's Amazon or I
any
store a card on a hotel, rental car, airlines. What do you want to use the card that you have on file that ends in the last 4 digits? Yeah, that's the one.
And they're not storing the card number and all the details. They're storing some representation of that they can send to
they quite literally
the credit card provider.
Store the last 4 numbers. If they're retaining the PAN in any way, shape, or form, like if you have you want to, you're regularly purchasing stuff, you want to keep your card on file. They're very often these days not storing the encrypted card that they resubmit for authorization. They store a token. It's some sort of permutation, some sort of value that identifies a specific card that's generally held by a third party, and the third party is the one that's got the actual card information.
Oh, I see. I saw that because I was squaring away the bills for our studio, and I was doing that. I'm like, I don't want to remember to pay the bill. I want you to store my credit card number, but they're not actually storing the credit card numbers. The third party is storing the credit card number, and then there's a partnership that allows them to. Yeah,
I mean, very generically, it's the way Google Pay, Apple Pay, all the different online versions where you've put in a credit card somewhere, Venmo, PayPal, whatever. The card's in there somewhere, but it's stored by a third party that will ultimately have a way to connect whatever token, whatever value is stored for your name identifies a specific card that eventually somebody's got to take the credit card number and submit it to the banks and the card reader for authorization. Okay. But it's sort of, it's a little bit of a game where you're pushing it out to a third party, and it's fairly common these days. But the breaches that have happened in the last week or two is it's, I mean, we should have a whole segment on this, really, where we're talking about the ramifications of third parties, the ramifications of cloud security. And well, I've put everything in the cloud, I've pushed everything off to a third party. So third party supply chain, call third party.
I was going to say it's a lot of, sounds like the finger pointing that happens in supply chain vulnerabilities and or security issues, where everyone's got kind of a piece to the puzzle, and when there's an incident, they point fingers at each other. And I don't want to say that anyone's acting malicious or like point the finger at any one given vendor, but it can be difficult to go like, who's really at fault? Well, like, you're all at fault, and like, but which part are you at fault, and how do you remedy the part that you're at fault for?
Well, that's what the lawyers are going to do, right? I mean, this is one of the things that I think right. Like,
it's like when you get in an accident, like how much, exactly. It's like, am I at fault or is the other person at fault? But like, if I had to go through this, but like, what I learned that I didn't know before is that you can be partially at fault, and just exactly what you said. The lawyers determine, how much at fault were you? And they have to present evidence to go, how much at fault were you in this accident? Were you 80% at fault and the other person's 20 or flip-flop? And they got to make their case in front of a judge. And then the judge and the jury makes the decision of how much you were at fault. And then the fault determines how much remediation that you get as a result of that.
Yep. And this is going to end in a lawsuit. And someone's going to owe someone money.
Right. And how much money is going to be determined on how much fault there is on the various pieces of so in this case, the supply chain, really.
Well, so, Live Nation, Ticketmaster's a merchant. They do PCI. So they're, allegedly they're PCI compliant. They've gone through the assessment.
I like how you say allegedly. I love that.
Well, off air, I'll expand on it more. But in theory, they're PCI compliant. And to me, when I first read the article where they talked about the compromise and they recovered it, the bad guys gained access to some database that had all the customer information, including the stored, whatever it was, credit card number, which might have been encrypted, might have been a token, might have been a hashed value, whatever it was. They also had a field in the database where they were storing the last 4 digits, because that's a good way to look up and try to make sure you're dealing with the right card for the right consumer. They somehow got to the database, and the database was apparently in the cloud at this cloud hosting provider that was Snowflake. And so there's going to be all sorts of arguments as who's responsible for the security of it.
Right.
This
is the Spider-Man meme. You ever see the Spider-Man meme where there's multiple Spider-Mans and they're all pointing at each other?
Yeah. I mean, this is exactly the case. And this is where I think we should have a segment where we talk about this, the ramifications of it. One of the breaches that happened, whether it was the same group or not, was a bank. And apparently they got to a
Santander, which used to be, which I think we might have talked about it last week, which used to be my bank for certain things. But then I closed out my account, and nothing against Santander. Again, like, I don't think it's worth anyone's time to like point fingers and say bad things about companies. Stick to facts, like whatever. Right. It was just circumstances, right? But in those circumstances, I was like, the bank has records, and then there's been certain junctures where I'm like, if I ever needed to get those records, if I don't have them on paper for some reason, can I go back to the bank where I had that account?
Yes.
And could they pull those records
for up to 7
exactly
years?
That, like, the accountants are like, well, yeah, like if push came to shove, we could go do that. And they may charge you a fee to go access those records. And then when Santander came in and they had a data breach, I was like, oh, wait,
how long do they keep those records, and do they store all the data?
7 to 20 years. Yes, they do.
Right. But they must store something that can identify me with those records, because if I can go back to the bank and get those records, I have to present my, let's say, federal tax ID number for my LLC. They can go, oh yes, Mr. Asadorian, we have those records. Give me, $85 or whatever, and we can give you your statements.
Well, and the breach of this bank talks about how they compromised and were able to recover. Again, it's probably a database dump where they had all their customers, their people that use the bank, and they have all their records, including their credit card numbers. And here's one of the ironies and the idiosyncrasies of the PCI world. Banks, and there's two kind of banks in PCI. There's acquiring bank and issuing bank. And issuing bank is the bank that gives you the credit card. So you have a credit card in your wallet, and you got it from some bank. Banks are the ones that issue credit cards. Whether even if it's like a hotel or rental car company, it's tied to a bank. They're called issuing banks. They issue the credit cards. They are technically not responsible for being PCI compliant. Acquiring banks are the banks of the merchants. So you go into whatever store and you pay with a credit card. Your bank is the issuing bank, and they're going to give the money that you've spent to the acquiring bank, which is the bank of the merchant. The acquiring banks also technically don't have to be PCI compliant. So banks notoriously, they can keep all the credit card information, and they don't technically have to encrypt it, obfuscate it, hide it in any way. So this particular bank that was breached, they got all the records of all their customers, all their whatever you call people that work at a bank, use a bank. They got all their information, including the credit card information, which was in the database. It was probably not encrypted because they technically don't have to.
Jeff, I have a question that's somewhat related. Because I've always cautioned people not to use debit cards, because debit card essentially plops a credit card on your bank account. And I was always uncomfortable with that idea for like a whole host of reasons that I won't go into.
With significantly fewer safeguards, yes.
Exactly. And so, very well put, summarized. So, but my ATM card, so like I forced my bank to issue me an ATM card that didn't have, like, it doesn't have a MasterCard symbol on it. So like I was like, I can't use it as a debit card.
Right.
And so I have just an ATM card. That's what I use to go to the ATM, and I withdraw cash. However, I was at a particular merchant, and their ATM was not working. It couldn't dispense cash.
Right.
And they said, well, if we just do this transaction as if it were a debit card, it will just pull the money as if it was an ATM card. And I'm like, there's no way that's going to work, because I told my bank not to honor that as a debit card. However, they ran the card and it worked.
It's an ATM card is a debit
card. And
how does
at the time I was like, well, I'm kind of thankful, because it was a weird situation where the ATMs near my house, both the one that was the bank I do business with and the one that would charge me $3.25 to withdraw money, it was not my bank, both those ATMs were out of service. It was like a weird, I don't know. It was around the time with solar flares. I was like, whatever. But also the ATM at this establishment wasn't working either. But the transaction was, how is that possible?
It's still a debit card. An ATM card is a debit card. It's not a Visa check card or MasterCard check card. It doesn't have a credit card overlay. As an ATM debit card,
it still has a chip in it.
It still has a chip in it. You still had to punch your PIN in, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's still a debit card, and you did a cashback transaction, as a debit card is intended to do. However, it wouldn't have worked as a credit card.
Right, because it's not this particular...
And Jeff, I assume I got that pretty correctly?
Yeah, this particular merchant is not allowed to do credit cards. Put it that way.
Right. Well,
no, are the edibles good?
On the back end, a credit card transaction is a separate data flow stream,
right,
with the
then
banks and the card brands,
so you're
and a
even
debit
though you
card
can,
is
but
tied to your your
bank
checking
account,
account, your bank account, and but years
but
ago they figured out.
there's no way to undo the debit card aspect. If you have an ATM card, it's going to have a chip in it,
Well,
and
I had
it
an
can be used as a
ATM
debit.
card for years, issued by my credit union, and I would use it just to get cash out of an ATM, usually at the credit union facility.
Right.
And eventually they said, okay, we're doing away with ATM cards. We're going to issue a debit card, where the debit card, it's a separate transaction on the back end between the banks and all the clearinghouses and stuff like that.
Yeah, ACH.
Right.
It's a separate network. It's a separate data flow, and don't even get me started on the lack of security and the lack of focus on ATM and debit,
because you can get cash back when you do that, because you can essentially,
it's a
the point of sale system will
process.
it'll process a transaction, but it'll also act as an ATM and it'll give you cash.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming there's a system in the back end that reimburses them for the cash that you
well
take
remember
out.
it's
just weird.
The whole system
It's
is
just
based
weird.
on allowing people to be able to buy stuff, and everybody makes money off of that. The banks and the credit card companies, they all get a piece of the action, and so they want you to be able to do that. So they're trying to facilitate in any way, shape, or form. But there's a big difference between you have a credit card, and technically, if you read the small print on the service agreement when you get a credit card, the credit card is not actually yours. It's the bank's.
Right.
It's owned by the bank. The debit card, however, is tied to you and your account. So, it usually comes up, and it happens to me on occasion. You go to a hotel and they want to, pre-charge you for, incidentals. And they'll usually have signs at the counter. We're going to pre-charge you $500, and if it's a debit card that you're using, it's gonna show as a deposit. But we'll sort it out eventually, and
we release it later. Yeah.
But if it's a credit card, it's not a big deal. Nobody thinks about it. But if it's a debit card, it's actually your money that's in your bank that's all of a sudden been earmarked and flagged as, this has gone to them. And so you don't have that available balance. It's in some ways it's convoluted. It makes sense to the banks, but keep in mind that it's all based on everybody wants to make money, and everybody gets a little piece of the action and they want you to be able to use your card, whatever it is, to pay for stuff, because they get a percentage of it.
Yep. And they get the interchange fee.
All of that.
I wanted to switch back to vulnerabilities for a hot minute and talk about end of life hardware and or software. And it's interesting that my story number 3 was Zixil, which the headline reads, releases patches for firmware vulnerabilities in end of life NAS modules. And I'm just, so at my day job at Eclipsium, we disclosed a vulnerability in a previous version of software where the feature was removed in a future version of software, and they decided to call that fixed, and no CVE was issued. But then in this case of the NAS modules, Zixil released a patch for something that was end of life. And I'm like, I don't know if they've been listening to me on the show and go, we should listen to Paul, and we should fix stuff that's end of life because it's the right thing to do. Maybe I had some influence on that. Probably not. But I think it's weird how they did this. And it got me thinking, like, you do this for NAS devices, but not for firewall devices. But does it come down to how easy or difficult it is for a vendor to patch an end of life device, and how easy or difficult it is for that patch? Like, is the pushback from vendors going, like D-Link is a great example recently. Like, there's a vulnerability in an older D-Link router, and they're like, well, that is already end of life, and we're not going to push a patch for that. Is that just like the stock standard answer? And they haven't gone back and looked and gone, hey, you know what? It would actually be pretty easy for us to push a patch for that. Now, the consumer side, I think, is different from the enterprise side. I think on the consumer side, the margins are so low, they want consumers to go buy a new device. Maybe on the enterprise side, they go, we want to retain these folks as customers. Therefore, we want to support these end-of-life devices. But still, there's that economic, again, it comes back to, my dark reading article about incentives. The incentive is I want the enterprise customers to buy new gear because they're going to spend lots more money with us. But is this all just kind of, is it a case by case basis, or is it just like kind of a global thing of, well, it's end of life, therefore no patch? Is no one going back and looking, going, but actually it'd be pretty easy for us to patch this vulnerability in the end of life product, right? And why shouldn't they just do that? Do you earn brownie points with your customers for doing that, or do incentives just get in the way? I'm not sure.
I have a suspicion about this one, Paul. So I worked at Red Hat for a long time, right? Red Hat end of life to a handful of products while I was there. And there was, let's say, more than one product that a customer showed up with a dump truck full of money and said, how about you give us some patches for this product?
So they flip the incentives model. The incentives model goes out the window if someone shows up with a truckload of money.
We were very upset because as security people, end of lifing something was a very exciting moment, because we're like, we finally don't have to worry about patches for this horrible old thing anymore.
You didn't realize it was a line in the sand that
That's
you just, like, smooth it over and erase if someone showed up with a dump truck full of money.
As long as there's enough money, that line can go anywhere you want it to go.
Right.
And I would not be surprised at all if someone showed up to Xilinx and said, here's a bag full of money. Why don't you give us some patches for this stuff?
Right. Well, Microsoft did a similar thing with XP. They said, you can pay us more money and we'll patch it.
Right, exactly.
Well, and this has been a huge issue in the PCI world, where cash registers, point of sale systems that were built on XP, Windows 7, and these merchants are, we want to be able to use this stuff as long as we can. And all of a sudden and there's a PCI requirement that says you have to install critical patches within 30 days. And so long ago it was, like, well, if something's not being supported, there's no patches coming out. How can you keep something secure if there's no patches coming out? So Microsoft, in their benevolence, came up with extended programs where you could pay for, if you're willing to pay for it, we'll give you the extra support.
But I think I'm oversimplifying it in that I can look at a particular vulnerability in some kind of firmware, let's say, and go, well, I can get that. Like, I can take apart that firmware. I can upgrade the library and put the firmware back together, and it's updated, problem solved. The cost, that's easy. The real cost is regression testing that entire firmware and then supporting all the other weird cases that customers are going to go, well, this functionality still, doesn't work after I applied that patch, because in your regression testing, you missed this use case, and now you got to go back and apply another fix. And as we all know, anytime you touch software or change it in any way, now you got to go back and regression test it again, and like you're in this endless loop of continually applying software updates, because as you change things, you could introduce another bug. Now you got to introduce another fix. And so from the vendor side, now I'll flip and go to the other side. From the vendor side, I get it. I get why you need to end of life things and draw the line, not in the sand, but like draw the hard line and go, we can't support this anymore, because ultimately you end up going out of business if you're to support every single product that you ever made for the entire life cycle of it. Now,
here's the problem, Paul.
Ahead,
and when I was at Tenable with you, this, what was it that was expiring, XP or 7, whatever. There's a lot of organizations out there, right or wrong, they respond to scan results from a vulnerability scan engine to know that they need to do something. And Tenable, if it was an unsupported end of life operating system, they would simply, the Nessus result would simply say, hey, you're running Windows XP, it's unsupported, that's an issue. And so they would stop. There was no additional vulnerability scanning of anything on that device, other than when they found that it was an unsupported, they would stop the scan and say, this is unsupported. But there's many companies out there that rely on right or wrong, the vulnerability scan results to respond to vulnerability management and patching and all that kind of stuff. And that's where the problem lies is, you know, the extended support that Microsoft would offer for XP necessarily meant if there's a problem with some sort of associated software, you know, something that part of the operating system, something that's a vulnerability that needs to be addressed and patched. Nessus, not to pick on Nessus or Tenable, wouldn't find that. Therefore, they wouldn't be able to respond to it and do anything about it. All they would have to do, all they had was, we've identified this system as running an unsupported operating system.
Right. But once it's unsupported, no more fixes from the vendor are applied. So once you discover it's unsupported, there's no new stuff to find. Right. And I don't know exactly
except for the extended support that you would pay for.
Yes, you're right.
I had clients that would
correct.
pay.
Right.
I mean, I had one client in particular, and I want to say it was XP.
Well, then you got to pay your VM vendor for extended support in the VM.
You pay for the
keep paying. You just got to keep writing checks.
Yeah, it's all money based.
Mm-hmm. But I think this is also speaks to where I was going to, like, go on the flip side of this. And my story number 4 is actually a great example of this. Is, I don't know if you saw the announcement of Ubuntu Core. And Ubuntu Core is really neat, highly specialized Linux kernels and distributions tailored at highly specialized devices such as IoT. And it actually leverages, which I was happy to see, Microsoft's Azure IoT, which is that framework. So this is not just Ubuntu Core is not just an operating system that you deploy in these highly specialized devices. It's an ecosystem that allows you as a vendor to provide not just highly performant and specialized operating systems and kernels for specific devices, but also continued support, management, secure management of those devices, right? A lot of the downfalls in IoT is that ecosystem is plagued with these types of vulnerabilities that allow people to gain access to things they shouldn't because of the way the system is managed. So it's secure management that allows you to have that extended support. I think Ubuntu Core is promising like 14 years or something of like patches and support. This to me is a step in the right direction when we talk about vulnerability management and all the issues that we face today. This type of effort to me is part of the solution. Make it easy and cost effective for the vendor to support these devices and operating systems and software for a longer period of time. And to me, that's what Ubuntu Core is trying. Have you guys seen Ubuntu Core or read about it?
I know of it. It's so the consumer in me says this is brilliant, and the security maintainer in me is like, this is my nightmare.
Because you get the long tail.
Yeah.
Because you're never done supporting something
right.
you did.
Right.
I mean, look, go 10 years ago. What did I create? And now I have to still support
exactly.
it. No, I get it.
Well,
good Lord, I don't want to support code I wrote yesterday, let alone code I wrote 10 years ago.
Exactly.
So I'm thinking if they're committing to 14 years of support, I mean, how many of those embedded gizmos we buy these days have a Linux core kernel in them?
Pretty much everything now is what we're coming down.
Yeah, more than you think.
Yeah, and actually that's what I was, when you mentioned 4 billion devices earlier, I was thinking if we add those to it, how many do anyway? My point was going to be, you know, if we could have a long supported OS in that stuff and keep it updated, we win. I feel for the guys having to support an OS for 14 years. Don't forget that. But I'm thinking as a consumer, you know, because we're going to keep shit online because it works, not because we should.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, so if there's a chance we could raise the bar a little bit because we got a long running whatever. But when I first heard of this, I didn't actually think of the IoT use cases. I actually thought of, you know, containers where we want the smallest OS underneath there. As I think somebody in this, that would be something Paul learned me on. Yeah, I thought of you, Paul, with that. That would be, you know, because finding a good OS kernel that's light and small. I mean, remember all the work you used to do to strip shit down? I mean,
yeah, but in containers allow you to do that flexibility of upgrades and stuff like that.
Yeah,
right?
I'm just saying. That's where I thought about it first, but
I don't think this is a container though. I think this is meant for devices.
This is for like the use cases they have is something that like takes your picture. It looked like this giant photo booth, but it wasn't a booth. It was something that like took your picture and like projected it on this like giant screen kind of thing. And it's like Linux and like Raspberry Pis underneath, and it's highly specialized, right? And yeah, it's pretty cool. You got to read the article and see like the thing. Where is the thing was really cool. Whatever they had. Well, yeah, they're talking about automotive, industrial, robotics, signage, smart cities, that kind of stuff. Is what this targeted as.
But I mean,
also, I think it's kind of a cool thing if you've got I was like, well, wait, what if I got a lot of Raspberry Pis and I want to just manage them all with this? Like, is that a use case for me to manage like my Raspberry Pis and keep the image up to date in a secure manner and having it be performant? I mean, it's tailored towards ARM-based processors that in Raspberry Pis are all on the list of supported hardware for Ubuntu Core. And Larry has these really cool 3D printed cases that hold multiple Raspberry Pis that he's bringing to we have a lab right over there now in our new studio with 12 monitors that we can do hacking things with. I'm excited about it.
That's going to be
more
awesome.
More to come on that. Yeah. We're still sorting through a 19 years worth of hardware, basically.
Nice.
Which it's a long story. In any case, I think that rounds out the show. I want to thank everyone for joining and listening today. That will conclude this episode of Paul Security Weekly. Thanks everyone for listening and watching. We'll see you next time. Over